Welcome back to Morning Joe. Joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Also with us, co-host of Morning Joe First Look, Ayman Mohyeldin. He has a new piece out in Vanity Fair investigating the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. Also, Yasmin Vasugian back with us as well. Thank you both very much. Senator Murphy, I guess first of all, let's talk about the president's Twitter feed. I want to get right to the new head of DNI, or the new choice at least, but you're going to unfollow the president. What's that going to, what is it going to accomplish?
Yeah, if I want to unfollow the president, I need to get into a different line of work. Listen, yeah. I just, yesterday morning, I just decided that I had enough of starting my days with this kind of racist, hateful, demeaning negativity. Obviously, I'm in this business, and I am in the United States Senate to try to stop his hateful agenda from moving into law. But it's just, to me, I think a moment in time where we all need to find ways to sort of lift up the way in which we talk. And sometimes I get trapped by reading the president's Twitter feed and trying to immediately respond to it. And I don't want to be in that cycle anymore.
So look, the media has its job to do, Senator Murphy, and I'm not asking you to do the media's job, but I'm just thinking, if I were you, or if I were in a position like this, I would walk right over to any Republican counterparts that I am friends with, cameras rolling, and say, what gives? Where are you on this? Are we the friends that we thought we were? Are we working together for the same country? Where are you on this? If I had the ability to do that, I would do it. Where are your Republican counterparts? And what's your responsibility to start talking to them face to face in broad daylight with cameras rolling on what is happening with the racism emanating from the Oval Office?
So, we've had lots of those conversations over the past 2 years trying to prod our Republican colleagues to step up and, do what Republicans did.
What stops them?
Well, I think there's a number of things that stops them. One, they're afraid of him. They don't want to lose a primary, and they tell us, well, you'd be better off with us in the Senate in the long run rather than a bunch of Trump clones who get elected in primaries. Second, though, they make the case, many of them, that they are working behind the scenes with him to try to smooth out the rough edges. And if we took him on directly, politically, it'd be worse than it is today. I think this week you can't make the case any longer that it could get any worse. He is literally setting this country on fire. And so many of us who have listened to that argument from our Republican friends who tell us don't take away our ability to try to talk to him and influence him quietly, we're going to call that out as the BS that it is and try to get them to finally do the things that many did in the 1950s to finally marginalize Joe McCarthy. It was Republicans who did that, not Democrats ultimately. And this is, I think, a week in which there are going to be probably harder conversations in the Senate between Democrats and Republican senators than there have in the past.
Speaking of your Republican friends, the president has announced his new choice for DNI, Congressman Ratcliffe. So 2 questions for you. First, do you think he's qualified for that position?
So I don't know this guy. I think he's a television character that the president has watched on TV, and he wants to put somebody in this position who's going to agree with his political take on intelligence. So I'll certainly do my own evaluation, but it strikes me as a very inappropriate choice for the job at a moment when we were trying to lift intelligence out of the political soup, something that Dan Coats tried to do on a regular basis, and he should be applauded for that.
So his confirmation would seem to be not assured. There will be a handful of Republican senators who will perhaps carry his fate in their hands. How will you push them to do their job and, if needed, vote against him?
Well, again, I mean, this will be a lot of hand-to-hand combat in the United States Senate. And I don't think the president's comments in the last couple weeks, which are certainly making a lot of Republicans uncomfortable, are going to help Ratcliffe's confirmation. His meetings and his hearings will be important, but he can't escape that Twitter feed. He can't escape the fact that he has been one of the president's accomplices in trying to politicize intelligence. And so we'll be having a lot of conversations, I think, with Republican senators in the coming days.
All right, so now to this. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi ignited worldwide criticism of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. However, it's not the first time the Saudi government has taken similar actions against those who speak out against the kingdom. It's something that Ayman has been investigating for a new piece out today in Vanity Fair entitled The Crosshairs. And Ayman, tell us what you found.
Yeah, Mika, this was an investigation I've been conducting for the better part of the last 5 or 6 months. Traveled to different continents, interviewed more than 30 people, including the families of Saudi dissidents and Saudi activists. Some of them disappeared. And it was quite a stark contrast of what we've been hearing from the Saudi government. Because on one hand, shortly after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, we heard from the Saudis that this was a rogue operation, that this was an anomaly. These were agents of the state acting on their own. But when we kind of took the big picture approach over the last couple of months and started piecing together the timeline and the attacks that have been happening on various Saudi dissidents and activists, we can see that there's a clear pattern that has emerged here between cyber attacks against Saudi activists that live in Europe, that live in the U.S., that live in Canada, for example. And what we've learned for the first time is that Americans are being caught up in this. In one brazen operation that the Saudis went after a Saudi prince in France, they also kidnapped with them 3 Americans that were flown to Saudi Arabia against their will, held for 3 days. They had their phones, their passports, everything confiscated, deleted, and then flown back to the U.S. That was something that has not widely been reported. We had a chance to speak to those Americans for the first time and hear their accounts. And also, in some cases, there are American families that have a Saudi relative that has been taken in custody, and they have not even heard from over the course of the year. So there are some troubling implications, I think, for American citizens. We had a chance also to interview Congressman Adam Schiff, who said that he wants to do a deep dive to get a better understand the threat and risk that is posed to perhaps Saudi residents that live in the U.S., but also Americans that have been caught up in these operations.
So Senator, you're hearing what Ayman says and his involvement in silencing these dissidents, of course, his involvement, as we well know now, in the murder, the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And then you think about the president's veto of this bipartisan resolution to block Saudi arms sales, $8 billion. The president says it's going to hurt our economy if we don't stick with this arms deal. How do you square that?
Well, listen, what's so bizarre is that after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, after the imprisonment of several American citizens, the reported electrocution of at least one, the president has rewarded the Saudis with an even closer relationship, with more transfer of nuclear technology, with this arms sale, which, by the way, actually robs American companies of jobs, because in that arms sale, the president has allowed for a technology transfer to the Saudis to let some of these smart bombs be built there rather than in American companies. And so it's just not true that this is about American jobs. This is ultimately about rewarding a Saudi government for their abuse of the United States in our relationship. And we look weak to the world right now because we have signaled that if you capture American citizens, if you use our weapons to kill civilians, as the Saudis are in Yemen today, there will be no consequences. In fact, we will bring you closer. And of course, the question here is why, right? What is the reason for the inexplicable nature of the Trump actions on Saudi Arabia? And I think he's told us what the reason is. He has told us that the Saudis put a lot of money into his properties. We know that Jared Kushner makes a lot of money off of those families. I think this may be very, very personal. Listen, he's trying to do everything the opposite of what President Obama did, and clearly that's an aspect of his reorientation away from Iran to the Saudis. But I think there likely is a financial explanation for this policy.
So, Ayman, this is David Ignatius. Very powerful reporting about Jamal Khashoggi, my late colleague. I want to ask you about something that I find particularly troubling, which is that the person that you identify in your piece as essentially the organizer of these efforts to go after dissidents like Khashoggi, a man named Saud al-Qahtani, it has not been charged in Saudi Arabia. From everything we know, it continues to operate, even advise his former colleagues. What about that? Why is there so little apparent effort to assign responsibility and accountability?
You know, David, that's a really tough question to understand without having very keen insight into the mind of the Crown Prince, MBS, and more importantly, the inner politics, if you will, of the royal court. He is somebody who has demonstrated a willingness and ruthlessness to serve this Crown Prince in a way that has earned him a lot of reward and trust within the upper echelons of the ruling elite in Saudi Arabia. The interesting thing has to do with why has he not at least been put on trial or charged. We simply don't know how serious the Saudi government is about trying to bring these individuals who are involved in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi to trial. How much of this is genuine? How much of this is lip service to the Americans and to other countries who wanted to at least see some kind of measure in order to justify the big picture, as we heard from the senator here saying that it's business as usual between the Trump administration and the Crown Prince and the Saudis? Was this just enough to keep them quiet? I mean, the Americans have put Saud al-Qahtani and others on a sanctions list, but it's not enough for the Saudi Crown Prince to say, I'm going to take one of my most senior, loyal advisors and put him on trial, because then it sends a message perhaps within the internal Saudi leadership and others that serve this Crown Prince loyally that if you somehow get exposed, if you get caught, you could possibly face the death penalty or face even more severe consequences in prison, that they don't want to simply go down that road. And so the message now is if you serve the Crown Prince loyally, there's no accountability.
So, Senator, actually, in terms of a follow-up from both this and just the larger conversation we're having, it is about what are we doing and what controls are we putting on both this administration and thinking about 2020 and beyond. A lot of the conversation has been focused on this idea of, is there conversations with Republican lawmakers about will you stand up, will you say something? But the truth is that politicians will move on where their constituents tell them to move.
That's right.
Right? What then is the conversation about beyond having the private conversations with Republican lawmakers about the constituents, about being able to address things like everything from voter suppression and voter enrollment, but then also about asking the citizens to be able to help drive and steer this conversation instead of waiting to be led by politicians who might have different reasons as to why they will or won't do certain things.
So listen, that's exactly right. Listen, ultimately, this is a grand experiment, the idea of a democratic melting pot, right? We get to govern ourselves, and we do it in a multicultural country. We've never had this before, and 240 years in, we want it to be around for another 240 years. And so this is a moment for citizens to stand up, to run for school boards, to ask questions about whether their local elections are being protected. What is their state government doing? This is a moment to celebrate diversity at the local level, to reach out to somebody who worships differently than you, who comes from a different place, to welcome immigrants into your town. So this doesn't ultimately have to be only a conversation that happens in Washington or on these shows. This is a conversation that can happen in communities all across the country, and citizens can take control of that. And that's the miracle of this nation, is that it ultimately just isn't on our shoulders. And frankly, it'll put more pressure on those Republicans if they see Republicans and Democrats, right? Local elected Republicans can stand up and say something. And if they do that, maybe it will lift up and put wind beneath the wings of the Republicans here in Washington who have been very silent for far too long.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you so much. Ayman's new piece on Saudi Arabia is in the new issue of Vanity Fair, and you can catch Yasmin and Ayman both hosting Morning Joe First Look every morning, weekday mornings, right before Morning Joe. Thank you guys so much. I love it. You wake me up.
High five.
Yay. And David Ignatius, I want to congratulate you, David, because first of all, we had the Navy naming a destroyer after your father, and you spent the past few weeks in the Middle East with the U.S. military. So tell us about both those experiences.
Well, we've been talking about some painful things this morning. I had the great pleasure of seeing America at its very best over the last couple of weeks. Over the weekend on Saturday, the Navy did commission a mighty destroyer named for my dad, who's now 98, the USS Paul Ignatius. My oldest daughter called the ship to life in an ancient ritual. Sailors ran on board and took their places. As she did that, she was standing in for my mom, who passed away in January. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been traveling with the CENTCOM commander, General Frank McKenzie, throughout the Middle East. We were in Oman, then we were in Jeddah, then we were in Afghanistan, then we were in Syria. That picture is showing it's a kind of Mad Max look at our forces out in the desert on the very southern border of Syria. That's me aboard the USS Boxer, which was the last stop. The Boxer's now the most famous ship in the Navy because it disabled the Iranian drones that were flying over the ship. That's a view out a V-22 Osprey as we were going from one place to another. That's one of my colleagues getting a little shut-eye there. And that's a view of Kabul in Afghanistan at sunset as a Black Hawk helicopter prepares to take off. What I'd say, Mika, is that when you're on a trip like this, you see the very best that our country has. Young men and women who are serving in these very dangerous war environments, doing so bravely and creatively. Every time I make one of these trips, I come back with some confidence about the power and momentum of the country that we love, represented by these young soldiers, sailors, Marines. You know, they are out there every day, and they sure are doing a great job.
They give us hope. David, thank you very much. Coming up, President Trump is denying accusations of racism after attacking Congressman Elijah Cummings. Trump was also accused of being racist in 2017 after the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, accused because he was. You can see it. Former Governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, joins us next with a behind-the-scenes story of that violent Unite the Right rally. We're back in just a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.